Overton Window podcast listeners have been treated to a wide variety of guests in the past, but only a few of those actually knew Joe Overton, the podcast namesake, before the Overton Window concept was born. In today's podcast, three of us who will look back on the Overton Window concept and reflect on Joe Overton personally. Lawrence Reed and Joe Lehman are with me today. They are past and present presidents of the Mackinac Center. I'm Mike LaFaive, Senior Director of Fiscal Policy for the Center. Larry and Joe were two of Joe Overton's closest friends, and their relationships with Joe go back to the late 1980s. I first met Joe in 1992. Joe and Larry, could you please tell us how you came to know Joe Overton?
Well, I met Joe Overton when I got off the plane in Midland, Michigan in January of 1986. I was interviewing for a job here with the Dow Chemical Company. And Joe already worked for Dow, and Dow sent him to pick me up at the airport to make sure I got fed and make sure I showed up for my interviews, and that's how we met.
Larry?
Well, you met him about 9 months before I did. I met him in September of that same year, 1987, but it was not in Midland. It was in Seattle at a conference, and I had just made the decision to accept an offer to come back from Idaho, where I'd lived for a couple of years, to Midland to be the first president of the Mackinac Center. And some people at the conference who came to it with Joe and were from Midland introduced me to him. And I remember saying, "Oh, I'm coming back in about 3 months, and we're going to open a think tank downtown." And he said, "Well, be sure to let me know when you get to town, and I'll volunteer." And he showed up within days of opening our office. Would have been in January of '88.
And you know, Joe told me that story because Joe invited me to that conference in Seattle to go with him. And I had just gotten married and had used up vacation and didn't want to go on vacation without my wife after only having been married for a few months. And so you and I would have met at that point in Seattle, yeah. Except I said no to going.
Wow. So Larry, recruiting Joe to leave Dow and join you at the new Mackinac Center probably wasn't as hard as it might be to recruit some other engineer from Dow to come over, but could you tell me how you persuaded Joe Overton to join the center full time?
Well, I really didn't have to twist his arm. It was apparent that I think he liked his job at Dow very much, but it was also apparent to me as I got to know him that he was very passionate about ideas of individual liberty and free markets. And I brought him on first as a volunteer in the fundraising area because we didn't have the funding yet to hire him. And it was in 1992 that we brought him on to the staff when we finally had some funding to begin to build the staff. But I think he welcomed the opportunity because he was so passionate about liberty and free markets.
And Joe Lehman, if I'm not mistaken, it was Joe Overton who then recruited you to leave a perfectly good engineering job at Dow and join the Mackinac Center. How did that transpire?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And everything Larry just said about Joe Overton's migration from Dow to the Mackinac Center, I remember from my perspective, it was Joe saying, I think I'm going to do some volunteer work for this Mackinac Center. And then it was, I'm thinking about going to law school. I might want to do more with the Mackinac Center. And then it was, I think I'm going to work part-time for the Mackinac Center. And then he said, you ought to come with me, Joe, to the Mackinac Center after he had made the move. And I said, no, that may be good for you, Joe, but I love Dow. My exact words were, I'll never leave Dow. But he did prevail upon me eventually. And in January of 1995, I joined Joe Overton and Larry at the Mackinac Center. And we weren't the only three. There was a staff by then of a handful or two.
One of my favorite professional moments in working with Joe was when we discovered that the Michigan Education Association was contracting out at its headquarters for non-instructional services like cafeteria services and with non-union labor. And we made a big deal out of that. And I think the press attention and the subsequent legislation that came after that kind of shifted the Overton window as a direct result of that research. When that happened, I think districts across the state, they're about one-third were contracting out for non-instructional services. And since that time, and because of the legislation that was passed and inspired because of our research, it's grown to about 70%. So that's one of my favorite professional moments. And I'm wondering very specifically is once Joe arrived, what were your first professional, pleasurable experiences with Joe? What did you learn from him? How did he guide Mackinac Center strategy, operations, and or fundraising in the 1990s? Anything specific stand out?
Well, I was the public face of the Mackinac Center in our earliest months because for a while there was only a receptionist and me until we could grow. But as we grew, it became ever more obvious to me that I needed somebody who had a good ear for internal organization and management so that I'd be freer to hit the road and raise funds and be that public face for the center. And because Joe had a managerial background and was keenly interested in things like total quality management and some of the principles that govern the best run companies, I thought, well, he's the guy who can bring order out of the chaos here and free me up to do more of the things on the road that a president needs to do. And he was absolutely invaluable at that. He really built our infrastructure internally. And then when we brought on Joe Lehman, who also had similar characteristics and background, wow, I had a management team that I thought was second to none. And the three of us together, I think, was a great constellation. And I'll always remember the phenomenal things that we did as a team as we built the center.
Joe?
Yeah, Joe and I worked together at Dow. We were both engineers there. And I guess I don't think I ever would have come to the Mackinac Center if I had not worked with Dow or with Joe as an engineer. We found that we had a common interest in the ideas of liberty and political economy, but it was Joe who really forced me to systematize those ideas and take them to their roots. Joe was better read than I was in all of those things, and so I really looked to Joe as sort of a philosophical guide for making sure that my beliefs seemed consistent. And really that was very important to us at the Mackinac Center because, that was what we had going for us, was our philosophical consistency. That's what made us different in the political ecosystem in Michigan. And when I hit the ground at the Mackinac Center in January of 95, it was only a couple months later in March that a project Joe spearheaded just took the Mackinac Center's fame to new heights and made us a force to be reckoned with, even with Republicans who I think thought we were just going to agree with them on everything. But Joe, Larry, you'll remember this.
Oh, very well.
Joe spearheaded the idea of taking on the popular Governor Engler early in his first term. Regarding Governor Engler's industrial policy idea. He campaigned against industrial policy and corporate welfare, and then he proposed a program to do those things in his second term. And it was Joe who primarily authored our first study, and it made headlines around the state, and it prevented the governor from passing his legislation on the first attempt and on the second attempt. And finally, he got it through on the third attempt. That's when the public knew that we were truly independent of the political parties.
Yeah, I think it was about that time. I don't recall if it was before or just after, but Joe also spearheaded our first in-depth analysis of the state budget. And that also sent a powerful message statewide that we were prepared to criticize anybody in government who was growing it without good reason. And we pointed out that there were a lot of places in the state budget that where we could make savings and serve the taxpayers better. And Joe was the key instigator behind that study.
Yes, and that was a study that again caused our opponents to say, I think our opponents respected us, and it made some of our friends realize that we could be friends, but we were principled to start with. And the way that I like to just think of the working relationship that the three of us had uh, was that Larry, you are great at having a million wonderful ideas, but they've all got to be done in the next 5 minutes. Drop everything and work on these million ideas. Now, Joe Overton had his million good ideas too, but you needed 5 or 10 years to accomplish any of them. He would come up with these grand schemes, and it was my job to sort of wrestle both of your plans down to earth and figure out what we could actually accomplish.
Well, the years-long vision is a good segue for a recollection I have. Wasn't he deeply involved in the idea of packaging initiatives so we could raise money for the Mackinac Center in 3-year chunks?
Yeah, he was an architect. I don't know that it was exclusively his idea. I recall working with him very closely on it, but the notion that we would likely do better at fundraising if we could go to people and say, you have the opportunity to continue to give to us for general operations, but you can also help fund an initiative. And the first one was labor policy.
Mm-hmm.
But we very strategically came to this idea that, hey, if we're going to make big changes in Michigan, we have to work on labor issues since this is a strong union state. And unions had enjoyed some special privileges over the years that we thought did not make good sense for the state. And so we put together that first initiative. Joe was very much involved, and if not the key architect, where we secured funding to hire for the first time full-time policy staff, a director as well as an assistant within labor policy. And that became a template that we used later for education and several others.
And that was especially noteworthy in labor policy because that way of thinking, raising 3 years of funding in advance for an entire policy initiative, allowed us to attract Robert Hunter as our first director of labor policy. And he was Ronald Reagan's first appointee to the National Labor Relations Board. So you've got these burgeoning little state think tanks all around the country. And I don't think any of them had anyone on their staff of Bob's stature, but we were able to attract him because Joe was able to make the case to donors and then to Bob that this work should be done at Mackinac.
And early on, Bob put in writing, Michigan will become a right-to-work state.
Yeah.
And so that's another fun part of our history.
Maybe I should point out that another reason I think he found it attractive to come to work for us. This was before we built our own building, of course. We were located behind Pizza Sam's here in downtown Midland. And if you liked pizza, you couldn't ignore the aroma. So Bob was very good about taking a tiny little office behind a pizza parlor because he liked pizza.
Well, this might be a good time to take a little break from talking about Joe and actually ask you, Joe, about the concept of the Overton window itself.
Sure. I first heard about the Overton window before it had that name. And the concept came from Joe Overton. And in the early days of the Mackinac Center, Joe was wrestling with a method of convincing people to support the Mackinac Center because Joe and Larry would go meet with entrepreneurs and Larry, steer it anywhere. I wasn't at those meetings, but this is what I recall the discussion being. You'd go meet with entrepreneurs and you find out, well, we agree on this and we agree on that, and we all believe the same things. You should support us. You entrepreneurs should support the Mackinac Center. And they would say, well, why should I support the Mackinac Center? I agree with you guys. That's why I support good candidates for office. And so there needed to be a way of explaining how a think tank uniquely creates an environment where elected officials can do the right thing. And so Joe came up with the idea of a window that slides in one direction toward more government control and the other direction toward less government control. And when you look through the window, you can see a narrow range of policy options. And so at the top of the scale, those are the Options for less government control. The bottom of the scale, more government control. The idea is, if you're the Mackinac Center, you want to move that window so that the only options visible, the only options possible are less government control instead of more. And so Joe actually created a little cardboard mock-up of a brochure that had this sliding window on it, and it proved too difficult, too expensive to ever produce. We never produced it except the handwritten copy that Joe made. But Joe never called it the Overton window. He called it the window of political possibilities. Really kind of a think tanky name, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And we would train other think tank executives and professionals as to how think tanks use this window idea to shift opinion, to shift the climate of opinion. And it was only after he died in 2003 that someone, I think it was you, Larry, decided let's name the window after Joe as a way of honoring him.
It became a very important element in our effort to convince people to invest in ideas, for sure. You mentioned, Joe, that meeting with people who heavily gave to politics, we did that frequently, but we had to tell them, look, we're not saying don't give to the candidates of your choice, but put a little bit of resources aside, if not most of them, to change ideas. Because if you just focus on politicians, it's like locking the barn door after the horses left. A 50 or 60-year-old politician isn't going to dramatically shift his ideas unless the public has shifted and tells him he better or he'll lose. And so the window was very important to convincing people of that.
Let me share some numbers with you about the window concept. This has gotten into at least the U.S. vernacular and to a lesser extent in Britain. This year alone, there have been 1,500 citations of Overton window in the press, public, academic journals, that sort of thing. A few highlights on August 8th, Vivek Ramaswamy on a news program, national news program, mentioned the Overton window. Joe, you just did a BBC interview, and it was published in Spanish for the Latino audience or Spanish-speaking audience. The top outlets this year that have mentioned the Overton window include Vanity Fair, the New York Times, Boston Globe, Seattle Times, Washington Post, Forbes, The Atlantic, The Hill, GQ. The list goes on. Last year it was mentioned 2,000 times. So even members of the popular culture are mentioning it. Russell Brand over in Britain, Viola Davis, and the list goes on. So it really has taken on a life of its own. And most people, I think, use it, the idea correctly, but have expanded its usage.
As a sign of how it has matured and become a part of the general political lexicon. In the early years, when it was cited, I think authors who were referring to it felt compelled to add a qualifier or a descriptor, to explain what it is so readers would know. And now you often see it simply referred to as the Overton window, as if everybody knows what it is. So that's a sign that it's really grown.
One shift in the Overton window that I deeply regret, that Joe Overton never lived to see was the adoption of our right to work law. That would have given him a great deal of joy. Unfortunately, the window shifted back a little bit in the recent months, and I was wondering if you could talk about that shift and what it means to Michigan.
Sure. When ideas are brand new, they're never embraced with open arms. They begin as unthinkable. Every idea that we take for granted now, it started out as somebody's unthinkable idea, and then it became laughable, and then it became merely implausible, and then it became plausible, and eventually it becomes policy. And so this is what happened with Right to Work in Michigan. When the Mackinac Center opened its doors in 1987, it was unthinkable that Michigan, of all places, would become a right to work state. And only a think tank working with a time horizon longer than a 2-year election cycle could shift the Overton window in the correct direction. And so in 2012, the legislature passed a right to work law. But it was in 2009, when the Detroit Free Press, in a public opinion poll, this is the large liberal leaning newspaper in the state, in 2009, even half of union households were ready to adopt a right to work law in their survey. So when the political stars were aligned, that's exactly what the legislation did. Now, why did right to work go from unthinkable to something the people wanted? Because the Mackinac Center and our allies and groups that thought like us said workers should not be compelled to support a union. And all of a sudden it became policy. So now, fast forward to 10 years later, our legislature with the Democratic trifecta, both houses of the legislature and the governor's office are Democrat. They repealed right to work. I don't think it means that the Overton window shifted at all because it still polls highly popular in the low 60s in Michigan. So what you have is lawmakers and the governor repealing a popular law. And I bet some of those lawmakers who voted to repeal it are sweating that vote right now because they'll have to answer for it in the next election.
Larry, after Joe passed back in 2003, you wrote several beautiful tributes, one of which included a Bible quote from 2 Timothy verses 1 through 7. Could you talk a little bit about Joe's character and remind us of Timothy?
Yeah, that is from one of Paul's letters, and it appears in 2 Timothy as verse 1:7. And I found out after he passed that was his favorite biblical passage. And it reads, For God did not give us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. Well, when I learned that it was Joe's favorite Bible passage, it just struck me as, well, of course. I mean, it so beautifully described Joe himself. You know, he was extraordinarily self-disciplined. He would plow on ahead no matter what the odds or the obstacles might be, because he knew that, you know, that's what people of solid character do. You work hard for what you know to be right, and the odds or the obstacles in your way should not be a deterrent. That sprang from his essential character. I think I learned more from Joe about character and its importance than I ever did from anybody else. And it wasn't because he gave lectures on it, he just lived it. You saw it. He lit up a room when he walked into it, and people kind of knew right from the start that, wow, this guy is straight as an arrow. This guy is as honest as the day is long. This is a guy who means what he says and says what he means. And all those other great elements of strong character, Joe tried to live up to them, and he really did. He really was a fine Christian gentleman of solid character. And if you were halfway awake, you couldn't help but rub off on you.
Well, I'd like to share a thought on that as well. But first, I would like Joe to talk about Joe Overton's character, because you had spent a great deal of time with him as well, and we're very close. I think Joe Overton shared everything with you. You were very tight.
Sure, very close. When we met, neither of us were married, and we spent a lot of time together, and then eventually working together at Dow and the Mackinac Center meant just a lot of time. We trusted each other, and you could say that about the three of us. And I wouldn't even draw the circle around the three of us, Mike. You were part of that. I mean, one of the reasons that you came on board was because Joe Overton believed in you. You know, there wasn't necessarily money in the budget to hire you when that happened, but Joe and Larry were strongly convinced that anybody who could stake out MEA headquarters needed to be on our staff with a paycheck. But the Joe's character, that being one example, Joe took a bet on you and on me, but on you, that bet proved to be a home run. It was great. Look at all that you've done for Mackinac. I remember one time, I guess our division of duties was such that I was really kind of handling the budget and internal financial affairs of the Mackinac Center, and Joe thought that one of our coworkers was deserving of a raise, and it wasn't a particularly highly paid coworker. And boy, it was tight. Fundraising was a little behind, and the money just wasn't in the budget. And so we decided, we just couldn't take the money out of the budget. Well, The coworker got a raise anyway, and it came from Joe's pocket. And the coworker never knew, to my knowledge, still doesn't know that. And that's we can go on and on and on with little stories like that. But the way I like to sum up the effect of Joe's character was, Larry, you said something close to it. You said when he walked into a room, the room lit up. But the way I remember it is, when Joe walked into a room, he raised the standards of conduct in that room just by being there.
Definitely.
People just knew that about him.
Okay, the two of you have both provided me with great segues. So I did not receive a raise from Joe Overton's pocket, but I haven't told many people this. He actually gave me a bonus from his own pocket. So I received an envelope with a check in it written out of his account that was meant for me as a way to say thanks for your hard work. Because the Mackinac Center didn't have the budget for formal ones.
Well, you may recall when he passed in June of 2003, we announced it, of course, on the website, and people had the opportunity to post a comment there or send a letter about the ways in which Joe made a difference to them. And that produced an absolute stunning cascade of testimonials from people. And I learned a lot that I didn't know about Joe, things that he was doing. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he was paying an occasional bonus out of his own pocket. He was helping people quietly, privately, and humbly at every opportunity, and never did it for the fame or the fortune or the attention it might get him. And so much of it we learned about after he passed.
Mm-hmm. Joe, we've talked about the past with Joe Overton and the Overton window. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the present and future state of public policy and the Overton window, and perhaps specifically to Michigan.
Sure. I think all the time, I wonder what Joe would think about this or that. And 20 years later, it really is impossible to know. People change, and people change with circumstances. And if Joe woke up Rip Van Winkle-like and could observe things today, maybe that's a little easier to predict how he might react. But we've all been affected by the way public policy and public discourse has changed over the last couple decades. One thing Joe got right was he understood the immense transformative power of the internet and even social media. There was no term for social media in 2003, at least that I'm aware of. But he innately understood that those sorts of networks and connections would be made. And he wouldn't have predicted every direction that it headed, but he knew change was coming. I think Joe would be deeply distressed by just the coarse turn of public discourse. The name calling, the lack of depth and analysis. I mean, it used to be when Larry, you hired me into the Mackinac Center, an op-ed in a newspaper was 800 words.
Yeah.
It was tough. It was tough to get all your brilliance into 800 words. But we did it, and any newspaper worth the name printed op-eds because they were full of facts, and they argued a position and left it there for the reader to respond to. Well, and then those op-eds became 600 words. And then the ones that still printed them, it was 400 words. And then they just kind of went away. And then we got Twitter, and now we're down to kind of bumper stickers. Mm-hmm. It is very, very hard as a public policy research institute to adapt to an environment where people don't really they don't have as many opportunities to be surrounded by well thought out ideas. They're bombarded with slogans more than ideas. And I think Joe would have poured a lot of his energy not into coming up with new ideas on policy as much as new ideas on how to communicate and persuade people, because at the end of the day, we're in the persuasion business.
Yeah, I agree.
The thing that I think most about, and I'd like our audience to know, is the Overton window itself might shift in the wrong direction on us occasionally, but in the last 28 years at the Mackinac Center, I've seen that swing back and forth, but the steady march has been ever in the right direction. Now, Larry, you have been in the freedom movement since 1965, if I'm not mistaken. I'd like you to share your perspective. What are your views on the state of the world today and its potential future?
In some ways, and Joe Lehman just touched on this, we are behind where we were 60 years ago. And most notably, as you said, Joe, in terms of people wanting to understand and to know an issue in depth. Instead, they jump to a conclusion based upon what a popular politician of their persuasion may be telling them. And that's very unfortunate. In the long run, I'm still an optimist. And that's in part because I understand, as all of us do at the Mackinac Center, how important ideas are and that they can change the world. It's just a matter of getting ever better at persuading people of the good ideas and getting them to adopt them. You can change anything. You can turn a nation around. You can change the conscience of a country just by how effectively you promote the right ideas. And also, I think it's important to remember that people of solid character, of which Joe Overton was such a great exemplar, do not give up on what they know to be right. It doesn't matter what the odds might be or the present moment and the temper of the times. You work for what you know to be right, no matter what the odds or obstacles may be. And you know that at some point when we win, people will say, wow, how did that happen? Where did that come from? And we'll be able to nod in satisfaction and explain that, well, back when lots of people said this could never happen, we said it could, and we didn't give up on it. And that's the nature of change. Ideas, as Victor Hugo said, are more powerful than all the armies of the world, sooner or later.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and so well said, Larry. I am probably the guy out in public who talks about the Overton window more than anybody else, and I'm often asked to give talks on how it works. And drawing from what I learned from working for you for 13 years and knowing Joe for 17 years, I've stolen liberally from both of you guys. And what I like to remind people of, and linking our work to optimism, is say every durable policy that we have, really durable, so durable that you can't really imagine it going away. Let's say the idea that women should be able to vote, women's suffrage. Okay, that's only been around about 105 years in this country. It was unthinkable before then, absolutely unthinkable. And pick your policy, whether it is environmental policy or the union movement or women's suffrage or civil rights or the abolition of slavery or whatever. Those were durable public policies, and they all began with social movements that were fighting against long odds.
Yeah.
The original leaders of those social movements were laughed at, ignored, scorned, sometimes arrested, but they did not give up because they believed in what they did. And sometimes that can go in the wrong way, right? We also had a eugenics movement that was began as a social movement, and thankfully that people thought a little more about that and saw where that led us, and we switched that policy back. But if we're not at some level optimistic, we have to be realistic about our challenges. But if we don't think that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons and that we can win and that we have to, if we don't think those things, I don't know if we'll make social progress.
I agree.
This is a good note to end on. I appreciate that optimistic final salvo. Appreciate you both joining us on the Overton Window podcast.
Thanks for taking the lead on this, Mike.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be with you again.